Welcome back to Reese's Side Quests, and today I'm going to talk about my visit to the Bone Museum in New York City. A brief look at their website, they describe themselves as the largest collection of human osteology on public display in the United States. And when I posted a short about visiting the museum, many people in my comments were concerned or even outraged at the museum's displays, mainly expressing the sentiment that it is immoral to own or display human remains without the express permission of the person, and where many of these samples' provenance have no records of such consent being given. The museum has a pretty prolific YouTube and TikTok, so if you're further curious about how they operate, their sourcing, and their kind of ethics around how they manage these collections, you can look at those. They have videos explaining it, they have articles on their website, or you can also reach out to them. Mainly this video is going to focus on the experience of visiting the museum itself. However, I did just want to mention a couple of things that I found interesting about kind of why this museum exists in the first place, and why these kind of samples aren't integrated into just other museums. Or also, additionally, why, these samples can't just be buried, essentially, as a lot of people think would be the respectful thing to do. And for one, certifications to acquire, handle, and display these kinds of semi-modern remains aren't actually held by many existing museums. And additionally, burial or cremation is not actually legally possible at all without a death certificate. So many of these remains passed through the bone trade of the 18 and 1900s, where they were sourced for medical facilities, universities, and research centers. And after that practice of using actual human bones was phased out, a lot of these samples were just kind of left in closets and kind of forgotten about, and people didn't really know what to do with them, and legally there was not many options for them. So essentially, without this place, like it or not, many of these samples would be improperly stored or thrown away. So to quote their website, "Our collection exists not to sensationalize, but to provide historical context for how medical education evolved, acknowledge the individuals whose remains were used to train generations of doctors, and to preserve these materials until broader ethical solutions can be developed." So the museum itself is located in Bushwick in Brooklyn at 255 McKibben Street. And when you arrive, it seems like a mainly non-commercial street, and you'll just see kind of a folding sign for the museum. You'll have to ring a doorbell, and the sign tells you which one to ring, and they'll unlock the door for you. You'll walk down into the basement and follow the signs to the museum. There's also some kind of gecko museum in the same building, which I didn't go to, but I'll have to go back and try to check that out. The tickets were about $20 per person, and there is a student discount. And I was thinking at first, like, $20 for a small museum, essentially one large room. That's the price of like a MoMA ticket, but it is such a unique place that it is worth it, in my opinion. And what makes the space feel much larger than it actually is the immense level of detail. There are probably thousands of individual objects on display, and every specimen has very detailed descriptions. I spent about an hour there looking over each shelf a couple of times, as I noticed new details on the second go-around, and was getting this footage as well. So the museum, by my observation, is composed largely of three elements. The first being just objects that talk about and kind of show the history of the bone trade. So this contains, this includes antiques, written records, and other ephemera from skeletal sales companies. One of the more disturbing pieces in this section was like listing prices of different skulls by grade of A, B, C, etc. based on the quality of the teeth. I did kind of like the vintage merch, though, honestly, from the skeletal companies, and I want some. And just one further note on this, I think the museum itself is pretty honest about the dark and questionable history of this trade, and like is actively kind of trying to reconcile with that. Like, take that as you will. Again, I'm not going to get that much more into the ethics side of this. The second segment, and this is kind of throughout the museum, includes antique medical displays. This includes many complete skeletons of differing statures, several dozen skulls in a central case, and a wall of spines, which gives me something akin to tryptophobia texture-wise, and I think that yes, it is kind of iconic, but in my opinion, it should be divided out individually like the skulls once they have some more space. One of my favorite parts of the antique medical displays were the phantom skulls, which are these skulls that are encased in lucite, a type of resin, but it's so finely done that it looks like they're encased in glass, and these were used for X-ray calibration, essentially. And then also the exploded skulls, which are practically works of art, where there's these mechanical kind of pieces that move pieces of the skull around so you can see the different elements of it. It's almost hard to describe, but you can see the photos of a couple of them here. The third category of specimen in the museum is the unusual samples with different medical conditions and unusual healings of the bone. And this included people who had had gigantism, who had had achondroplasia, and other genetic bone growth related disorders. In my opinion, it gives a very empathetic view to the reality of the struggle that many people deal with that we can't necessarily see because it's in their bones, literally. There was one that was a compound fracture that just fused in place, and I cannot imagine what that person went through. Like, it's truly shocking to look at that and imagine what the limb was like. I think this just gives a really important window for us into the human suffering of the past, both like before modern medicine, but also in places like 20th century or early 20th century India, where because of colonization, it intentionally was deprived of wealth and resources, and that probably contributed to a lot of these ailments that you see in the bones, as India was apparently one of the major sources of the medical bone trade during that period as well. And I think all in all, the museum does a fair job of not sensationalizing the, quote-unquote wacky appearance of the samples, even though that's obviously, that's naturally appealing to the average visitor. One last display I'm going to talk about that was incredibly interesting is the leg of a man named Johnny, who is in fact still alive. And he had his leg removed. I'm just going to give the very, very short summation. After he had been dealing with a chronic ailment and extreme pain in his leg, and he had been advocating to try to get it removed, but his doctors were against that, and so he was able to eventually go ahead with it and was relieved of a lot of that pain, and now essentially advocates for, amputation when necessary by pain, and not necessarily shying away from that as a solution in these extreme kinds of cases. So all in all, it was an incredibly interesting museum that I would recommend to anyone who's in New York City to check out. It really is a one-of-a-kind museum, and but I mean, if you're interested in biology, anatomy, or just generally have kind of a morbid curiosity about these kind of things and want to see it in person, I couldn't recommend it more, because there's just, like I said, it's unique. There's no other place that you're really going to see this kind of stuff, so. But yeah, make sure to check out their social media and YouTube channel. I'll link it in the description, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.